Hey guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined by Matt Karoly. We are going to be previewing the Falcons' Week 16 matchup against the Carolina Panthers this week. We'll be reviewing their Week 15 win over the Arizona Cardinals. We'll be talking about the just announced Pro Bowl, maybe talking about some players that got snubbed, particularly on the Falcons, as well as talking about or answering your listener questions. As we often do on this show, when there are roster moves, I'm sorry, that have occurred in the last week, we talk about them. And one major one happened this past week. The Falcons put rookie running back Ito Smith on injured reserve, dealing with a knee injury. Nothing major, but certainly enough to keep him out for the last two games. So the Falcons just freed up a roster spot. That roster spot went to practice squad running back Jeremy Langford, player we talked about, I guess, 2-3 weeks ago when we picked him up on the practice squad. They shuffled around the practice squad a little bit, adding Christian Blake, the wide receiver who was in training camp. He replaces wide receiver Julian Williams, and filling Langford's spot is an offensive lineman from William and Mary, an undrafted rookie by the name of Chris Durant, athletic guy that played some tackle. Maybe that's a tip potentially for maybe the Falcons shuffling their offensive tackle depth this offseason, but maybe that's a conversation for later. But Matt, what were your thoughts on sort of seeing the news that Ito Smith was done for the year?
Yeah, obviously disappointing. Ito, I think, was one of the bright spots in this very dark year for the Falcons. He showed a lot, filling in when Devontae Freeman went down. I had another nice game this past week against the Cardinals. And, the good news is it does, like you said, it doesn't appear to be anything major. It seems like a meniscus issue, which usually guys can bounce back from rather easily. Yeah, I mean, when you're dealing with a season like this where they've been officially eliminated from the playoffs and there's not a whole lot to play for, you are somewhat excited that now we're going to see some other guys being evaluated, and Brian Hill will be the next man up to fill the shoes of Ito Smith. So I'm kind of excited to see what he might provide, given some reps behind the actual starting offensive line rather than, getting to play with the backups in garbage time or in the preseason. So looking forward to that. And then, even Jeremy Langford was a guy I was hoping that he would be the guy called up just to see what he can still do. Cause I think I said on an earlier show a couple weeks ago that Langford is pretty similar to Brian Hill as far as he's bigger, but he's also, still got some shiftiness and still got some speed to him. He's not just, a lumbering goal line back or anything like that. So not sure how much we can expect to see from him this week. I think it will just be, a two-back, system like they've always kind of been with now, Tevin and Brian. But maybe we do see Langford a little bit more since they have been dabbling with Brian at fullback, and maybe they want to continue to do that a bit. So, those are my biggest takeaways and something I think to look forward to these last two games.
Don't have much else to add. I wouldn't necessarily expect Langford to play. I expect him to be inactive this weekend, and probably Ricky Ortiz sort of taking that third running back spot on the active roster. So we'll see. Just because
That's fair.
it would be weird to have Coleman and Brian Hill as your 1-2 punch, and Hill pulling double duty at fullback as well. But to be honest with you, I don't think the running game is going to be that big a factor this week against Carolina, just because I sort of expect them to shut down our running game. But that's, we'll talk about that more in depth later in the show. So I'll be curious to sort of see of the late season practice squad guys that the Falcons shuffle in and out. Historically speaking, typically the guys that they, most teams will take several of the guys on their practice squad and re-sign them to quote unquote futures contracts, which is basically they just re-sign them and they can bring them to OTAs and camp the following year. And historically, the Falcons tend to only keep the guys that were on the practice squad throughout the entire season. So some of these guys that wind up being late season adds don't wind up making it. So I'll be curious with some of the shuffling with, a guy like Langford being on the active roster probably increases the chances that he sticks around. But some of these other guys with some of the late season shuffling, I'll be curious to see if the Falcons wind up bringing back some of these guys, including a guy like Chris Durant. I just thought it was notable. One of the things that you and I and other people have been sort of speculating as of late is whether or not the Falcons are going to move on from Ryan Schrader this offseason. And if you go into the offseason with, not only Jake Matthews, but Matt Gano and Chris Durant on the roster, and then you can re-sign Ty Sambrailo, you have the makings of, I'm not going to sit here and say that you have the makings of a starting replacement for Ryan Schrader, but you have the makings of at least some back-end competition next summer in training camp. So we'll sort of see how that one. I forgot you still have, I think, Daniel Brunskill on the practice squad as well. So, these are just the sort of things that, for people like me who are obsessed with third and fourth string roster battles tend to think about.
Yeah, I don't know much about Chris Durant. I mean, I had no idea who that was. So, yeah, I mean, maybe he competes with Brunskill or Gano. But yeah, I know we talked about a little bit last night about Sambrailo. And, these next 2 weeks, I think, are going to continue to be big for him. I mean, if he's played pretty solidly, above expectations. So if he continues that, I think there is a good shot that he's back and, competing for, dare we say, the right tackle spot in some capacity. I know you roll your eyes at that, but it's a reality that we might have to face. So
my heart skipped a beat when you said that. So look, I think we'll talk about it in a moment, but I thought Sambrailo played well against Arizona, better than I was expecting. But I think at this point, unless he absolutely comes out here and dominates the next 2 weeks, I think the best thing that you can hope for him next season is as a swing tackle. But I'm sure we will have plenty of conversations about that.
Is a lot of it still just, what Vic did to him and just his what is it? I mean,
it's not just the Vic game. Like, it's what he did against Green Bay last year, and then what was the Lions game after that? I did not think he played well in either of those two games. And then going back to his time in Denver,
the Lions game, his run blocking was fantastic.
His pass protection was terrible, though.
It wasn't the type of, see, for me, it comes down to, is it making or breaking a game? And it never boiled down to that, where it's like, yeah, we're in trouble here right now. They got to get Matt out of there type of deal. So, I mean, he might have struggled, but
I think the reason why it didn't do that because the Falcons, not to rehash 2017 arguments, but the Falcons were heavily reliant on their play action passing game in those games. But I think if you're expecting Sambrailo, I think Sambrailo's fine for a game or two. You're not going to have, more than likely, you're not going to have too many of his weaknesses exposed to the point where you're like, oh man, Ty Sambrailo started one game or two games. We lost those two games because of him. But over the course of 16 games, I think those issues are going to get exacerbated. Particularly next season when you got to face guys, he's going to be asked to block guys like J.J. Watt and whatnot, and that's just too much of a liability to deal with. I think he's a backup. So far he's showing me that he is a capable backup, which he didn't show me up until this point. So I think that's a step in the right direction. But I think if you're expecting him to do more than be a swing tackle, I think you're asking for trouble, a huge, huge amount of trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to bring up Greg Robinson to kind of compare a little bit, because Greg Robinson, similar type of career as far as highly touted, busted, flamed out the first two spots, and now he's in Cleveland, and he's kind of righted the ship there, and he's stabilized that offense line. Now, maybe the play calling has a bit to do with that, and maybe that's something that would be an issue because, again, we haven't seen Sark help out some of the offensive linemen as much as we probably would want this year. But I think, guys, you said it yourself, guys, it takes offensive linemen a couple years to really come into their own. And I just don't think there's a big enough sample size yet to really say one way or another that there's no hope for Ty Sambrailo because, again, we've just admitted to him looking pretty decent these last 2 weeks against pretty decent competition for the most part. And, two teams that pressure the quarterback very well, and he's handled his own. So that's why, again, it's not something like I'm with you. It's not something I'd be ecstatic about if that's their plan. But I don't think it's just Ty Sambrailo. I do think they're gonna bring someone else in, whether it's a free agent or, we don't take a first round tackle, we take a second round tackle that we hope is the guy. But if he's not, the fallback plan is Ty Sambrailo for at least the interim until the guy is ready to be thrown to the wolves.
I just don't think that's a fallback plan. I think that's just, to me, that's the same as the Falcons going through the entire 2008 offseason with Quinn Ojanaka as their starting left tackle until they drafted Sam Baker. Like, if we are at a point come mid-April and Ty Sambrailo is the top of the depth chart at right tackle, we know that the Falcons are going to take an offensive tackle. And unlike, say, defensive tackle this past year where you had Jack Crawford and Grady Jarrett, and you were like, oh, the Falcons are going to definitely take a defensive tackle very high in the draft, and they waited till round 3. You can't wait till round 3 to get a starting offensive tackle in this league, even at right tackle.
Yeah.
Without going back and forth on this forever, I would say Greg Robinson is a much more talented player than Ty Sambrailo and played much better even when he was struggling. Like, if Greg Robinson hadn't been a top 3 pick, I don't think he would have got run out of St. Louis or LA or wherever they were playing him at that point as quickly as he did. So whatever.
Again, no, I'm not saying, because they're either taking a tackle in free agency, and if they don't, then we know they're taking one in the draft. It's just a matter of how high you going. And again, a lot of this does boil down to what they do in free agency, because I'm still the mindset that I think they need to go D lineman first round. But again, it's not all going to fall on Ty Sambrailo. But if you were suggesting paying him as a pretty decent backup, so if you're going to do that, the mindset is you're not super confident in whoever you're bringing in, because if you are spending money on a major right tackle, I don't think you're then, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think then you're sinking more money into Ty Sambrailo. I think you're either riding with Gano, or maybe you take someone in round 4 to develop as a future swing tackle if you don't think Gano's the guy. But that's why I started that conversation with you, because if you're advocating paying him a decent backup salary, you can't be too confident in whoever else is coming in the building.
Well, I wasn't really advocating it. I was just predicting what the Falcons would do, because we saw them basically do the same with Matt Schaub and Levine Toilolo, give those guys significant raises.
All right, advocate's probably not the right word. You're right.
Yeah. So that was more of a prediction than necessarily what I would like. If it was me, I'm like, Ty Sambrailo, appreciate your performance over these last couple of games, but we can do better.
Yeah.
But let's move on. Let's talk about the Pro Bowl, which was announced tonight. I paid so little attention to the Pro Bowl that I didn't realize that it was getting announced tonight. So I just randomly looked at Twitter and saw, oh, the Pro Bowl's announced tonight. So
yeah, you saw me going on my rants, didn't you, huh?
Yeah. 2 Falcons made it, Julio Jones and Alex Mack. We don't know who the alternates are for the Falcons, but I'm sure there are a couple of guys that are on that list, including the biggest snub here, which is none other than quarterback Matt Ryan. This was a conversation and topic that Matt and I discussed probably like a month ago, whether or not Matt Ryan would make the Pro Bowl. And sort of my thought process remains the same. I thought there was a chance that he might not get voted in. I didn't expect it to be Aaron Rodgers that would bump him. I thought maybe it would be Russell Wilson. But I'm pretty confident that he'll probably be one of the top alternates, and should Jared Goff or Drew Brees guide their team to a Super Bowl, he'll get an opportunity to be in the Pro Bowl. So I'm not too distraught over Matt Ryan not making the Pro Bowl. I think he obviously deserved it to be in alongside Brees and Goff. But at the end of the day, it's disappointing, but it's not that big a deal to me. But I'm sure Matt has other thoughts.
Yeah, for me, it is a big deal, because just this one alone, this would have been his 5th Pro Bowl. And I was doing an article over the summer someone asked me a question for my one mailbag piece about what I thought about Matt Ryan's Hall of Fame credentials were and would he or wouldn't he get in. And so I went through and looked at all of the Hall of Fame quarterbacks, and obviously the ones that had a ring, I kind of bypassed and went on because if you get a ring in this league and you've been around a while and you're a good quarterback, chances are you're getting in. The ones I paid attention to were the ones without a ring, just because right now, unfortunately, Matt Ryan is one of those quarterbacks as well. And basically, the common denominators I saw amongst those quarterbacks were each of them had at least 5 Pro Bowls and 1 All-Pro nomination. And so with Matt Ryan sitting at 4 Pro Bowls and he has the All-Pro season of 2016, basic math says he just needs 1 more to really get into that echelon. And as long as he kind of keeps the same pace that he's going on, you tend to believe he might not be first ballot, but he's got a good case at that point to be a Pro Bowl, a Hall of Fame quarterback. So for me, he's in the midst of his second best season of his 11-year career. That's what makes it even more frustrating because, again, what else? Obviously, the Pro Bowl, as we know, is a popularity contest, and that's why I think it gets the rap it gets. But, for me, I'm just getting fed up with is it the fans that we got to take out, or what's driving this that we can kind of shift this conversation in a different direction where the guys that are actually getting the numbers and actually putting together the good seasons are getting the nominations? Because you see writers and stuff, they're talking about the same thing, like who gets snubbed. It's not just fans like ourselves. So for me, I don't know. I think the Pro Bowl could be a legitimate thing if we're taking certain aspects of the voting out, which again, is it the fans? That's what I'm tending to think is, we're not Falcons fans, obviously, as we know, sometimes aren't showing up, not stuffing the ballots enough, I guess. So for me, I'm just pretty frustrated because, again, Matt Ryan putting up the second best season of his 11-year career, not too far behind that MVP season, and he's not a first ticket Pro Bowl nomination. That I don't get it, man.
I can admit that I think I've maybe voted for the Pro Bowl once in the last decade. So maybe I'm contributing to the problem. I think it's a flawed system. It doesn't make any sense to me why voting starts in week 6 and why a vote in week 6 counts as much as a vote in, say, week 14. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But like, for me, the Pro Bowl is just, it's a thing that exists. I hear you. I agree that, the number of Pro Bowls that Matt Ryan makes will help his Hall of Fame resume. But sort of looking at the numbers, like, he's going to play another 4 to 7 years. He's going to have 4 to 7 more opportunities to make the Pro Bowl, to get that 5th one. And, basically, if he's not in the conversation for a Pro Bowl at any point over the next 4 to 7 years, then at that point, you didn't have to start to ask the question, is he really deserving of being a Hall of Famer if he basically only had 5 or 6 Pro Bowl worthy seasons? But that's more of an extreme take. What I will say is, you look at Matt Ryan and his career prospects, if he has 5 more seasons like he's had the last 5 seasons, he'll wind up with like 69,000 passing yards, almost 70,000 passing yards. Tom Brady just passed 70,000, became the 4th quarterback ever to do that. So I feel like even if, Dan Marino has 61,000. So I feel like if Matt Ryan hits that 69, 70,000 passing yards, he's going to be just fine as far as the Hall of Fame goes, regardless of whether he has 4 or 5 or 8 Pro Bowls or whatever the case may be, in addition to obviously the Super Bowl rings, meaning, the most sort of thing. So I'm not too worried. Like, I feel like, again, I think there's a high probability that Matt Ryan will be playing in the Pro Bowl, and being, an injury replacement or a Super Bowl replacement counts the same on your resume. No one knows the difference between who got voted in and who's a replacement player. So I think this is mostly, in my eyes, outrage for nothing at this
Well,
point.
I mean, I can easily see, though, Russell Wilson being that first alternate. So at that point, you have to have two of those guys go down, whether it's Rodgers with an injury, which is likely because he was dealing with a knee all season. And then obviously either Goff or Breeze making the Super Bowl, which I know none of us want the latter to happen with Breeze. So, again, usually it happens because you see a bunch of alternates get in, but it would be such a Falcons luck thing or a Matt Ryan luck thing for him then to not get in this year. And because, I mean, you pointed at, I saw Fred Taylor, all the snubs that he got over his career, and he's a heck of a player. So it wouldn't shock me. But again, you talk about the longevity, and he will have more bites at the apple here. But again, putting up the numbers he's putting up, it's just, it's frustrating, but I guess that's life as a Falcons fan. So what are you going to do?
Yeah, it happens. Look, of all the hurt and pain that this team has given me over the last couple of years, like Matt Ryan getting snubbed for the Pro Bowl is very low on the totem pole for me. As far as other snubs, you could probably make a case for Jake Matthews. I don't know who were the three left tackles that wound up making the Pro Bowl. I didn't look that up, but I'm sure they were all pretty deserving because I saw Andrew Whitworth was a alternate as well, so he's always been playing at a Pro Bowl level pretty much. So,
and usually with some of these young guys, the season you kind of deserve it a little bit. You don't get it, and then you get it the following year is kind of how these things work. So, if the Falcons bounce back in 2019 and have a good season and Jake continues his play, I think that could be the year he gets it for the first time. But yeah, I mean, he had a case, but the guys ahead of him, I don't complain about. I didn't see all of them, but Joe Staley, I think, was one. He's been playing well, still in San Francisco. Who else?
Tyron Smith, Teron Armstead.
Teron Smith. I mean, I think name recognition, but he hasn't had a great season. But Teron Armstead, I think, was an alternate. I mean, he deserved it. So, again, I don't think you can be too mad about that one. Really, Matt Ryan, I think, is the biggest one. Grady Jarrett, I think, is just a victim of the numbers game. There's so many good interior defensive linemen throughout the NFL, but in particular the NFC. I think Akeem Hicks, Fletcher Cox, Aaron Donald, obviously. Can't remember some of the others, but yeah, again, he is having a great season, Grady, but just being a victim of the numbers game, it's tough. And then, obviously with the Falcons being 5-9, I think it's going to hurt him too there. So other than those two guys, I don't really have a whole lot of complaints.
Yeah. I was about to make a case for Matt Bryant, but then sort of him missing that time probably tanked his chances.
Yeah.
Trying to think of anybody else. No, that's good. I know some people were like, "What about Casey? He led the NFL or is leading the NFL in interceptions." But it's like
Eddie Jackson was one of the safeties, and he's tied with him for interceptions, and then Landon Collins and Harrison Smith. I mean, those are guys that are going to be competing with Keanu Neal for years, so can't really find fault in that.
It's part of the sort of the flawed system. Like I was complaining about this like a year or two ago, that it's going to be hard for a guy like Keanu Neal to make the Pro Bowls because basically only one strong safety is allowed to make the Pro Bowl. It doesn't make sense, but it is what it is. Like they need to tweak the numbers a little bit and they need to do some things, instead of just having all left tackles, actually have people allowed to vote for right tackles.
Yeah.
Like two left tackles, two right tackles or something like that. Like it's a very flawed system. And basically that's part of the reason why I haven't voted for the Pro Bowl, because I just gave up on it a long time ago. And it's just like, this is broken.
And I just don't get, I mean, I know it's, with football, it's a game where, cause they're not really going at it. But there's some easy fixes, easy cleanups to do to make it somewhat more, that people care about it, that people want to actually vote, like you're saying, because that's exactly it. People just get indifferent about it because they're fed up with how it's set up. So, adding a fullback, sure, that's fine. But then why? Because of that, because it counts as a running back, you're neglecting a guy like Alvin Kamara or Tariq Cohen from making it. Like that doesn't make sense. Like, so yeah, but I'm totally with you. But I just think there's easy fixes around this to make it so that people aren't complaining about it. But maybe that's what they want, because then that drives the ratings of it up. I don't know.
Look, I mean, look, the NFL is unique in at least American sports, where 70% of the conversation surrounding it is complaining about it. You know?
Yeah.
So, it's one of those things where
I guess it's like people are showing that they care, so why, like,
it's kind of like the government, where it's like most people have zero confidence and zero faith in it, but it just exists, and you just have to like continue to like, oh yeah, they're all corrupt and whatnot, politicians and whatever. It's kind of like the NFL is like that. It's like, yeah, we like this league. It's the most popular sport in this country, but it's all sort of poorly run and corrupt and super flawed. And part of it, I think, is we kind of enjoy complaining about it. I certainly do from time to time enjoy complaining about it. So it is what it is. Like, again, basically, like a lot of these issues to me were apparent like 20 years ago. They haven't really solved them. I know they changed the voting format because it used to be purely a popularity contest. And then I think they allowed players to vote for it, and they tweaked sort of how much ballots cost. But again, like, I still never understand why the voting starts so early in the season when you haven't even seen half the year to be able to tell who's good or not. You just like have literally seen like 5 games from people, and you're like, oh, this guy's the NFL leader in rushing yards after week 6. Let's vote for him. And then, later on in the season, that guy gets hurt or something like that. And then somebody else who's been consistent through the entire year, winds up finishing at the top of the whatever. And that person, the person who voted for the first running back in week 6 or week 7, his vote counts the same as somebody, it just doesn't make any sense, but it is what it is.
Got someone in the chat saying, oh my God, can we forget about fullbacks in 2018?
No,
I'll let you, the fullback expert. Can we leave him behind?
No, we're never going to stop talking about fullbacks. Okay. Darn. Ricky Ortiz. Anyway, let's move on and let's talk about this Cardinals win. The Falcons were able to finally snap their 5-game losing streak, taking down the Arizona Cardinals, those pesky Cardinals. And the Falcons were actually impressive. And one of the things that we talked about last week was whether or not they would be impressive against this bad team, or would we continue to see bad football from the Falcons? It looked like that way for the first couple of series, and then Deion Jones got that pick 6, and that seemed to jumpstart the Falcons, playing, sort of adding that energy to the team that we kind of hoped he would add maybe a month ago, but unfortunately didn't. But, we'll take what we can get. I know you got into many a Twitter conversation about, the Falcons potentially losing this game and, or whatever. I'll let you summarize sort of that sort of thing. But what were your thoughts on this game, and sort of what are your thoughts on, the impact of the Falcons winning this one?
Yeah, it's just a relief, man. I'll tell you, because to have to contemplate a world where this Falcons team is losing to that Cardinals team, I don't know if I could. I mean, I'd be rethinking a lot heading into 2019, and that's what I was trying to get across to people on Twitter over the weekend was, obviously we think this team has talent, and I said it on last week's show, and I kept saying it and stressing it to them, was that was the worst roster in football that the Falcons just played. And I mean, you can say all you want about that, but good teams beat bad teams convincingly, and the Falcons did do that, which, I mean, that was good to see. And for me, I continue to think that this is a good team, when they're on, and this is a talented team when they're on. And, we saw that on Sunday. And I just think, the 5-game losing streak, that was just them playing some bad football. I mean, we rehashed it on the last several shows. I mean, whether it's turnovers in the red area, untimely penalties, bringing back large gains, effort not being there in the Cleveland game, not taking advantage of your opportunities. They just played some bad football the last 5 weeks. And I don't think it's indicative of really who they are when they're firing on all cylinders. So for me to see them go out there and have that performance, now you mentioned they did start off shaky, and I was worried that first quarter. I mean, the first 2 drives on offense, ending in sacks, or Tevin Coleman had that illegal, motion that brought back the Sanu conversion on 3rd and long. So it looked like it was going to be more of the same, but Deion Jones provided that spark with the pick 6, and then from there on out, the offense kind of got into a rhythm. They still had moments where, there was drops and some miscues. But I think the big thing is that turnover margin, and Dan Quinn spoke about it after the game. I mean, when you can be +3 in the turnover margin and capitalize on that, you can kind of get away with some other stuff throughout the game. And, I think that was the most encouraging thing was the defense taking away the football, which they did very little of this season outside of, DeMonte Casey, and really just got after, an inferior offensive line, which is, again, what you expect a good team to do. And they did that, and kind of everyone contributed, right on down from Vic Beasley, Bruce Irving. Steven Means was impressive again. Another game with, 2 tackles for loss. He added a sack, which very impressive move that I retweeted this morning, which he was rushing from the interior, which that's could be something moving forward, in 2019. Maybe they bring him back and he can play that Claiborne role in spurts. So yeah, all around impressive effort, a lot of standout players. Just happy to see the Falcons, kind of flex their muscles and show that they can be a good football team when things are firing, on all cylinders.
Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned earlier, I thought Ty Sambrailo played reasonably well. I thought Jake Matthews, I don't really remember Chandler Jones doing a whole lot in that game. No. So that was impressive. And it's one of those things where each week where Jake Matthews is going up against a matchup where I'm like, well, this guy could give him some trouble. For the most part this season, he's taking care of business. So that is a very good sign for his future moving forward, where we won't necessarily, we got another game coming up against Carolina where historically Mario Addison has given him a lot of fits in previous seasons. Jake was able to take care of business in that week 2 game. And so I'll be curious to sort of see going on the road whether or not he can sort of have a repeat of that, or do we see, more of a performance like we saw the last couple of years where Addison really sort of gets after Matt Ryan. So, yeah, it was a really solid performance. I don't really have a whole lot else to add other than what you said, Matt, where, things started off a little shaky. Then the Falcons sort of, got a spark from a big play from Deion Jones. Then the offense seemingly was able to build off of that and start to build a lead. And then after that point, the Cardinals just can't win that type of football game where the Falcons are able to pin their ears back. And it's sort of like that's basically the type of game that we've been wanting to see from the Falcons. Maybe the offense gets out to a little bit of a better start than that one. But for the most part, that's kind of what they need, is just to get that early spark wherever it comes from, the offense or the defense, and then just continue to build off of that. And that really hasn't been the case. We've seen some early sparks, and then they sort of falter, and then they don't really get it together until like the 4th quarter. At that point, the game is pretty much over, and during that 5-game losing streak. So it was nice to see this team sort of build some momentum, and hopefully they can carry that into this upcoming week against Carolina.
Definitely.
Do you have a brother of the week, which for anybody that's not a regular listener or viewer, comes from our good friend Evan Birchfield. It's basically the person who did the most for the team but won't make any of the headlines.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on him, but I'd give it to Jake Matthews, and I think Jake Matthews is maybe the brother of the year. Just very happy that he's moving along. He's climbing the ranks of the elite tackles in this game now, and we have him secured and locked up for the next 5 or so years. So for him to shut down Chandler Jones and kind of make him irrelevant in this game, I thought was big, because I thought we talked about what the the bigger matchups of this game was going to be, and Jake Matthews versus Chandler Jones was one of them. And, Chandler is very quiet. So for me, I got to go Jake Matthews.
It's a good pick. Trying to think. I'll go with Steven Means. I think he's sort of put together 2 solid games back to back. I was gonna, when you were talking about Ty Sambrailo, one of my responses was going to be, well, Steven Means has had 2 good games. Does that mean he should be sort of the starting defensive end for the Falcons next year? But that was just me being snarky. But I think Steven Means, I had a lot of confidence and faith and optimism that when the Falcons picked up Steven Means, he would sort of be a boost for this defense and this pass rush, and didn't quite play that way. Maybe in part that's due to him being asked to play the Derek Shelby role when Shelby was missing time with that groin injury earlier in the season, which is not really what Means does well. He's more of a Leo than a strong side defensive end. At least that's more what he was in Philadelphia. And, maybe it just took some time for him to sort of hit his stride and sort of the impact he's shown the last couple of games, particularly being sort of a penetrating run defender, as well as, providing some pressure on the quarterback, is sort of what I thought he would be from the start. But, it took, 3 months or whatever for him to get it together. But, it's coming at the right time. And you sort of mentioned him being a guy that sort of could have a role for this team's, what that role is, I don't know. But I certainly think he's performed at a level that deserves to be, retained by this team next season and compete for some spot in the team's 9-man or 10-man defensive line rotation in 2019.
Yeah, I wrote about it in my article today that, I'd love to have both Steven Means and Bruce Irvin back and kind of, swap out Vic Beasley and Brooks Reed, and then hopefully that they build on that and add to that, because I think Means and Irvin can give you or even exceed what Reed and Beasley have been. So, yeah, and I think the interesting thing how they were using Means too was, because Dan Quinn talked during the week about Justin Zimmer getting some reps with McClain being ruled out, and then it turns out that they deactivated him, and they use Means kind of inside. They were using kind of that bear front or that 3-4 look, and had Means and Grady being like the 3 techs. And, it seemed to work with Means penetrating the gaps and using his quickness on the guards. And, again, that's why I think the Shelby Claiborne role could maybe work for him, because he's shown, the propensity to have success inside, being that he's like 265, 270, I'd say. So, again, I think bringing him back, and he shouldn't command anything more than maybe vet min or a little bit above vet min. So, I think they definitely need to look into that more moving forward, because he's a good player, and, tap into that a little bit.
Fair enough. All right, let's move on to talk about this Carolina game. The Falcons are facing a Carolina team that has lost 6 games in a row, sort of blew an opportunity on Monday night against the Saints, sort of had multiple opportunities to put the Saints on the ropes and couldn't capitalize, then had a sort of a lucky break at the end, thanks to an excellent play by Tommy Lee Lewis, where he fumbled the ball out of the end zone and got a touchback and gave Carolina one more shot to sort of pull off the win, and they couldn't come through with it. But, holding the Saints to 12 points on offense is pretty impressive. This Carolina defense went from a unit that was struggling early in the season that has been pretty solid this past over these recent weeks. But their offense has been a little bit problematic. They're also, it's been exacerbated a little bit due to a shoulder injury that Cam Newton is dealing with. He's not necessarily on the injury report, but anybody that watched that game on Monday night knows that how sort of limiting it was for him, and they couldn't really push the ball down the field like they normally would do, and sort of became a one-dimensional offense, where it's basically run the ball to Christian McCaffrey or throw short passes to him. And if they play that way against the Falcons, I won't necessarily say that plays to the Falcons' strengths, because the Falcons really have no strengths on defense. But at the very least, you can come up with plausible sort of way where if you can have Deion Jones have sort of a repeat performance of like he had against Christian McCaffrey in that Week 17 game last year, where he did an excellent job containing him. And then if Christian McCaffrey is the entire Panthers offense, like we saw him kind of in Week 2 and that saw this past week, then you can sort of see this Panthers offense really struggling in this game. And even if the Falcons offense doesn't drop a 40 burger against a pretty good Panthers defense, you know, that's a winnable game if the Falcons can find a way to sort of keep this Panthers offense under control. So we'll have to see how it goes. Matt, what are your thoughts on this week's matchup, and what are some of the key matchups that you're going to be focusing on?
Yeah, I think first you mentioned Cam Newton and his shoulder, and kind of speculated, on Twitter this morning that, I wouldn't be surprised if they shut him down. I know Ron Rivera, I saw, made a comment at press conference today saying they haven't had any talks of that, but that was before, any sort of conversation with Cam that day or meeting with the training staff. So, I wouldn't be shocked if that's the route that they take. He did mention that he believes they still have a glimmer of playoff hope, and I guess technically they do since they haven't been ruled out. So
I don't see Ron Rivera shutting down Cam because he needs Cam to save his job. He's not going to turn to Taylor Heineke because he's on the hot seat. So if the Panthers do find a way to shut down Cam Newton, that's like a Marty Herney, David Tepper type of decision where they basically, Rivera's out, so we're just going to save our asset for the future. So
right.
I don't see that happening, but it's certainly, you're right, it is something that people have been talking about over the last 24 hours plus.
Yeah, so that's one thing to consider. The other one, obviously, too, you touched on. The big matchup is Christian McCaffrey versus Deion Jones, and that's the one that I'm excited for because we didn't get to see it the first time around. And, if I'm remembering that Week 2 matchup correctly, Christian was the biggest thorn in their side and will be for the foreseeable future. That's their offense. I've been very impressed with him. I didn't think coming into the season he could be the type of bell cow running back that he has been. He doesn't come off the field ever. So that matchup is going to be the make or break as far as the Falcons defense and, one that will go a long way in determining the game. I guess the other one, at least from the Falcons defense versus the Carolinas offense, no Greg Olsen. He's been shut down on IRR. So who does Cam go to? Who's his safety blanket at this point? And it seems like they're transitioning away from Devin Funchess. His snaps have decreased the last several weeks, and they're kind of turning over to the young guys like DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel, and Moore's really come along the last couple of weeks. So again, I saw Trufant doing a little bit of shadowing last week on Fitzgerald in the slot. I don't know if this matchup really is going to warrant any sort of that type of thing, but DJ Moore is someone probably to keep a close eye on. He did break loose in that first game, kind of a botched defensive play, to be honest, but he got a big touchdown in that one. So he's probably the one that concerns me most, other than Christian McCaffrey. But then I guess turning it over to Falcons defense versus, Falcons offense versus Panthers defense. I was looking at Football Outsiders and stuff as far as their defense is concerned. And, first matchup, Falcons ran on them pretty good, but I kind of agree with you. They've come around as far as their run game's concerned. And I think they're 8th last time I checked in DVOA metrics for run, and they're 29th in pass. So I think this is going to be another game where there might be an unbalanced game plan where Matt Ryan's having to drop back quite a bit. And at that point, you're hoping the offensive line holds up. And against this Panthers defensive line, I think it's not the most imposing matchup. They're still counting on Julius Peppers quite a bit. And, guys like Mario Addison and who's the other one?
Kawan Short.
Well, obviously Quan Short in the middle, but I'm talking
Oh, you can. Okay.
talking
All
edge
right.
rushers. I mean, obviously they're going to have to deal with Kawan Short.
All right.
But is it Wes Horton is their other edge guy,
Yeah,
I
Wes
guess?
Horton.
So, again, those two guys going up against Ty Sombrello, maybe I'm, falling into another trap again, but I think that matchup can be okay. So, for me, really, hopefully they can get a little bit of a run game going, but at the same time, I think even if they don't, they should be able to, barring Julio Jones being okay, and they say he's going to play, and I think he will, but barring anything like that, I'm not too concerned about the Falcons offense, but maybe I should be, and I don't know if you have more thoughts on that, but yeah, I think I'm just because the Panthers can play that ball control approach. They're one of those teams, so if Christian McCaffrey can get going, I think that would probably be my biggest worry is they revert back to something like that where the Falcons offense can't get into a rhythm as much because the defense isn't getting off the field due to the run game. So, maybe we see more Sanat, but I doubt it. I think Sanat's probably going to be playing the same level of snaps, and they're going to continue to ride, Jack and Grady inside and, maybe mix up more with these three-man fronts. So that's probably my biggest worry, though, is can they get off the field and get them in third and long situations?
I think the thing that goes in the Falcons' favor is that they typically have played pretty well against Carolina, as we saw that Week 2 game. I think Carolina is always this team that worries me because I feel like you sort of mentioned it where if they can get McCaffrey going, if Cam can sort of do Cam things with his legs and whatnot, like they can just sort of just pound this team into the dirt and sort of we'll have to see sort of whether that happens. I think the positive is there's indicators again if Deion Jones can sort of contain Christian McCaffrey and then the Falcons can sort of stop the run, which they haven't been particularly reliable at doing, then they should be okay. But it kind of always sort of boils back to this offense's ability to score points in order to, like, their best run defense is the offense's ability to get a lead and make teams, become one-dimensional because historically speaking, we just do not see reliable, good, sound, disciplined run defense from this Falcons team, which is the polar opposite with the Panthers. So it'll be interesting because I think the key to beating this Panthers team is attacking that secondary that you mentioned has struggled at times. We saw sort of them do that in that first game, spreading the ball around. Calvin Ridley had his breakout performance. Austin Hooper had some big plays in that game. I think Marvin Hall had a big catch in that game, and Julio was doing his thing as well. And so I think we're going to need to see more of that because, again, Tevin Coleman had a really good game against Carolina, but historically he hasn't had great success against that team, not to the same degree of Devontae Freeman. So I think it's likely, given the quality of this run defense, coupled with the fact that he's basically had like 2 good games and 6 tries or whatever against Carolina, that first game was more of an outlier. So I do worry that even though I think the Falcons can make the Panthers one-dimensional, I do think this Carolina defense can make the Falcons pretty one-dimensional. And with our backup offensive line, although they've played reasonably well, I still don't necessarily trust these guys that if the game is on the line and we need our offensive line to play well and be able to hold up against what isn't a great Panthers pass rush, but I certainly, again, don't want to sit here and act like guys like Ben Garland and Zane Beatles and Ty Sambrailo are world beaters, particularly when you have a guy like KK Short going up against a guy like Wes Schweitzer or whatnot. So I think this game could go either way. And it just really depends on which teams show up. If this sort of deflated Panthers team that we've seen the last couple of weeks that just can't figure out a way to get out of their own way, which was similar to what the Falcons looked like during those 5-week losing streak, then that bodes well for the Falcons. But at the same time, we could also see that same Falcon team show up, even though they're coming off of that Arizona win. And we could just, as you said earlier, it's like, oh, they stomped on Arizona because they were one of the worst rosters in the league. And then while they face a Panthers team that's struggling, but certainly is not untalented, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, and has some key spots on offense, then they could have a little bit of struggle. So this is a game that's hard for me to predict. Given that the Falcons haven't really played great on the road, I'm not overly optimistic that they'll find a way to pull off this win. But it also wouldn't shock me if the Falcons find a way to, I think more than likely it's going to be a close game. That's basically what I'll say. But who wins it probably will owe to the team who has the ball last, which we've seen multiple times this season with the Falcons team.
Yeah, I mean, I feel pretty similar about this matchup. I think the road woes do scare me a bit. They haven't looked really great on the road. I mean, what would you say is the best? I mean, Washington was the best road.
Washington the only?
It was the only road performance, I think, and that seems to be an outlier based on how well that they played in that one. So, yeah, it's going to be a close one. I don't think they're going to win by double digits or anything like that. If they do win, I think two offensive line points that I'd want to bring up before we move on in this matchup. I've noticed, well, I thought originally when I was watching that Arizona game that Ben Garland was back in full time and they were going to scrap the Zane Beadle experiment. But apparently, one of my followers brought to my attention that they're doing this rotation thing, I guess. And, when you're going up against a guy like Kawan Short or Dontari Poe, is that the best way of going about it, in your opinion? I mean, Ben Garland has had a decent time of it against Kawan Short. And, so for me, I don't know if they're still evaluating this and eventually they're going to pick one for the last couple of weeks, or they're going to continue to do this rotation. But in a matchup like this, I'd rather have, one of those guys be the guy. And if things get really bad, then maybe you turn to someone else. But for you, I mean, what have you seen with those two? And for me, pulling Garland in the first place, I thought was a little bit of an overreaction. I mean, he did struggle mightily in that Saints game, but up until that point, he was playing pretty solid. So that was kind of, for me, another head scratcher that DQ did this year, and something that makes me believe that, he's panicking a little bit. But for you, in your opinion, I mean, what do you think is the best move going forward there?
Yeah, we talked about that back then, and I agreed with you. That was basically what I said. It didn't make a lot of sense for me.
Yeah.
You could nitpick Garland's performance in previous games other than that Saints game, but it wasn't as if like he was terrible or anything like that.
No.
I thought it was interesting watching the game. I haven't watched the all 22, but just rewatching the game yesterday, the television copy. I thought Beatles really struggled in that game, and I thought Garland was definitely the better of the two. He was by no means perfect in that game, which is always the case with Ben Garland. Even in his best games, he's going to give up a couple of plays, and that'll probably be the case this week. But again, based off of the overall body of work, and then this past game against Arizona, I think Garland is clearly the better option between the two of those guys. It's not that I think Beatles has played terribly, but it's just I haven't seen anything from him to suggest to me that he's a upgrade over Garland. And you're right, sort of in hindsight, it does seem more like, given that it does seem more like the Falcons did it because they could, not because they should have. So I'll be curious to sort of see if they do continue the rotation, or they stick with Garland, or they stick with Beatles. At this point, predicting what the Falcons are going to do is become next to impossible with some of these roster decisions and sort of lineup shifts. So that could play a part, given sort of some of the issues this team has, and given some of the playmakers that Carolina has in their interior. You can't forget guys like Vernon Butler as well, who it probably hasn't lived up to the expectations when they drafted him, but still is a guy that's capable of being a pretty solid. But he'd be starting for the Falcons if he was on the Falcons right now. So, yeah. So I to answer your question, I think Garland has outplayed Beatles this season and particularly last week. But whether or not that's going to, the Falcons are going to pay attention to that and make the change, then we'll have to see.
Right. And the other point was Marshall Newhouse. Did Chris Clark go out of that game yesterday at all?
I noticed that Newhouse started the game. I know he graded pretty well for Pro Football Focus, and from what I watched the game, I thought he played pretty reasonably well. And
Okay.
most of the Saints' pressures seemed to come from blitzing, not necessarily beating that Carolina offensive line.
Yeah.
So I don't know what prompted them to make the switch from Clark to Newhouse. I imagine Clark wasn't playing great, but I certainly wasn't paying attention.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's one thing to watch. I know Taylor Moton's been pretty great this year for them as well. So really, if Newhouse can keep up that play, it really comes down to, can Grady Jarrett and Jack Crawford make an impact, or some of the other guys that are going to be rushing from the interior, because, we saw it in the first matchup. Taylor Moton kind of stonewalled them, and, even Chris Clark did. So I'm not expecting a whole lot from the edge guys necessarily in this one. I know I've said before that Vic Beasley loves playing against the Panthers, loves sacking Cam Newton. He has his most career sacks against them. But, I think if they are going to affect the quarterback, it's going to be another Grady Jarrett game, which the last several weeks he's been amazing. I think Pro Football Focus has him as their top graded interior defensive lineman. And it's kind of shown in the last, especially this past week. I mean, he had his highest grade and he was just all over the field. So hopefully more of the same. I mean, he's playing for that big contract that he's going to get in the off season. So we can use another big one from him. So that would be another thing to watch for is, Marshall Newhouse, and, can Tack McKinley or Vic Beasley make any sort of impact against him? Because I don't think they're going to do it against Moton.
Yeah. I thought Tack played reasonably well against Clark the first time. He didn't dominate him, but he was able to affect the quarterback on a couple of those plays in that week 2 game. So I think if you're going to put any hopes on anybody, it's going to be Tack in this game, or maybe Irvin, who got the practice against Marshall Newhouse last year. So maybe he got some insights into sort of how he might perform. All right, let's move on and answer some of these mailbag questions. Our first one comes from Joe Bear 74 on Twitter. He asks, "Is there a scenario in which you see Atlanta trading down in the draft, or how about up?"
So I was thinking about this the other day, and I kind of was tweeting out where Atlanta might wind up if they win out, or if they win one of two, or if they lose out. If they lose out, I think, they're going to be probably 5 or 6 at the highest. If they win one of two, I think that 9 range, 8-9 range. And then if they win out, the floor might be 13 or 14. So if they win out, which I can see being possible, I do think the Falcons are better than the Panthers and Bucks. Now, whether they show it these last 2 games, that remains to be seen. But I can see a scenario where they win out and they're 7-9 and they're sitting with that 13th or 14th pick. And if that's the case, and based on what I know now, I can see them wanting to move out for the simple fact that, Ed Oliver and Quinn Williams are likely off the board. There's a scenario where maybe Ed Oliver slips due to size, or people want to make a big stink of that whole Jacket Gate fiasco on the sidelines. And then I think Jonah Williams, the top-rated tackle, will likely be off the board. So at that point, you're wondering, well, those are probably their top 3 choices, I'd say, right now. Depending on, again, if they get a tackle in free agency or whatnot, maybe that changes things. At that point, you're looking at the next best interior guy or the next best edge rusher, perhaps. And I just think that might be too high based on how I see some of the players right now at that spot. So maybe they want to trade back and take one of the edge guys, in the late teens. Or maybe they take, I know you're not going to like this, but Christian Wilkins in the late teens and accumulate some picks. So in the event that they're 13 or 14 and those 3 guys I mentioned earlier are off the board, I can see them wanting to trade down. And then on the flip side, trading up, to get one of those 3 guys, to get Quinn Williams, to get Ed Oliver, or to get Jonah Williams. Right now, I don't know if trading up to get Quinn Williams, I think he's probably a top 3, top 4 pick at worst. So really, it would be trading up if Ed Oliver falls a little bit and you want to just ensure that you get him, or if you want to ensure you get Jonah Williams. I think that's the type of scenario where you'd want to trade up.
Yeah, look, I can see a scenario with the Falcons trade up. I don't know exactly what that is because there's so many moving parts at this point with how the top of the draft is going to go, where the Falcons are picking, what needs they're going to fill in free agency, what needs other teams are going to fill in free agency. So, trying to envision what that scenario is, I have no idea. But what I was thinking about this morning when I was commuting to work is sort of like if I was to put money on what I think is the most likely outcome right now, what the Falcons do this offseason, and I wouldn't put much money on it. I'd probably put like $5 on it because, again, there's so many different variables. I would bet money right now that the Falcons wind up with an edge rusher, someone like a Josh Allen or a Brian Burns with their top pick. And I could see both of those guys going in the top 10 in this draft at this point. We'll have to see sort of how things play out, but it wouldn't shock me if the Falcons stayed put wherever they're picking, whether that's at 5 or whether that's at 13 or somewhere outside of that range, and sort of taking the top edge rusher. Again, like it's a shot in the dark at the best, but yeah. So I don't at this point, sort of trying to pinpoint who the Falcons are going to take is kind of, in my eyes, just kind of pointless at this point, particularly when you factor in that most years, like 4 out of the last 5 drafts, whoever the Falcons took in the first round was pretty much a surprise. So, I'm willing to sort of let things play out before I get too caught up in trading up or trading down or getting this guy or getting that guy. Obviously, I do think there are, sort of 3 pass rushers at the top of this draft that sort of are on a different level than the rest of the group. And then you can sort of haggle who's like 4 through 12 or something like that. But, and obviously I would want the team to land one of those 3. And I'm open to the possibility of trading up for one of those 3 guys. But, again, there's a lot of moving parts at this point to play out before I fall, on one side of the fence or the other.
Classic Aaron response right there.
I mean, it's December. Like I worry about the draft in March and April.
Just have fun with it. That's what obviously things are going to change. Obviously,
I get why people ask these questions. Like I've been doing this show for like 5 years, and every December we get these questions. So I get it, but it's just one of those things where I don't know. Like it's the best answer I can give you.
Okay.
Brian, your homeboy Brian asks, who do you guys think the Falcons could draft in the first round that would have a Deion Jones or Matt Ryan-like impact? Is there one guy in the draft that stands out, or is there multiple names? Nick Bosa is the name I hear the most that would help us the most. Your thoughts?
Yeah, Nick Bosa would definitely be like number 1. But then I also think, Quinnen Williams, Ed Oliver are right there as well. If they can land one of them, I think that would be phenomenal. And then, Jonah Williams, I like what I've seen from Jonah Williams. I think he's going to be rock solid. Maybe he'll take his lumps, early on. So, fans will have to have some patience with that if he's the pick. But long term, him and Jake as bookend tackles, that would be very exciting and good going forward. But yeah, I think those top 3 D linemen, those are the guys, if you get one of them. Now, obviously there's going to be guys, and I haven't dived in, deep enough to say, oh yeah, if they get this guy in round 2 or this guy in round 3, like, they did with Deion Jones, he's going to make a great impact. But those guys are out there as well. But I just think in the first round, those 3 or 4 that I mentioned, if they can get one of them, they're going to make a big impact early on, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that point. I think Nick Bosa sort of stands by himself in terms of a guy that has a really, really high floor. I think, I wouldn't certainly wouldn't sit here and act like I've, done in-depth evaluations of either Quinnen Williams or Ed Oliver. But I do think there's a little bit of a, I'm more enamored with their ceilings than necessarily their floors at this point. And I think, for Quinnen Williams, a lot of that is due to the fact that he's only really played 1 year as a redshirt sophomore. of extensive playing time, although he's outperformed any Alabama defensive lineman I've seen since Marcel Darius in that 1 year, including everybody's favorite Deron Payne from last year. And Oliver obviously has amazing tools and upside, but probably given the size issues and given, he's more of an athlete than a technician at this point, that he's not going to necessarily come in right away, particularly as a defensive tackle, and be this sort of, dominant force like I think people are expecting, given some of the hype surrounding him. So I think Nick Bosa, particularly given the pedigree of his older brother, coming in right away and basically being, a dominant player from, day one in the NFL. And I think you can make a strong case that Nick is a better prospect than Joey was. So, that's one of the reasons why he's probably going to be the number one pick in the draft, and deservedly so. So if you're talking about that type of impact where it's immediately like this dude changes the entire dynamic of the defense, I think Nick Bosa is probably the only guy in this draft that I would be really confident saying that about. But my other point isn't related to that. It's just I wouldn't necessarily put Deion Jones to impact on the same level as Matt Ryan's impact. I don't even think Deion Jones was the best rookie, defender on that team that year. So I think Keanu Neal would be higher on my list there. But I understand why you say that, Brian. But Deion Jones made a lot of great plays as a rookie, but I don't know if we're going to talk about him making this huge impact when the Falcons had a pretty below average defense that year. So I get what you're saying, but I would split hairs a little bit and say that Deion Jones didn't make that type of impact. Brian's next question is hypothetical questions. If the Falcons would have made the Super Bowl this season, do you think it would have been a home game where our logo is on the 50-yard line in any end zone with most of the fans cheering for us, or would it have looked like a neutral field with neutral fans?
Yeah, not only do I not think it would be a home game with the logo on the field and stuff, but I wouldn't be shocked if there was more of the other team's fans in the building for a Falcons home Super Bowl, if that were to ever happen. It's just, not to get off on a tangent and stuff, but yeah, I'd hope I'm wrong on that, and we'll never see it. But I think it would just be any neutral site game, if not the other team's fans more. But yeah, that's kind of, again, not to go off on a rant, but yeah, that's.
Well, look, I've been to a Super Bowl. I went to Super Bowl 40 in Detroit.
Oh, wow.
And there were a lot of Steelers fans there. There were a lot of Seahawks fans there, but there's a lot of people there that are there at the Super Bowl just to be at a Super Bowl. I was at the Super Bowl just to be at the Super Bowl. So it's one of those things where it's, even if it's in a team's home stadium, a lot of, to be able to afford to go to the game.
Right, exactly. That's part of it.
Necessarily in the price range of your average sort of fan. So it's a higher tier of sort of earners in order to get that. So, I would probably say that the Falcons would probably have a slight advantage, but I don't know if it would be like an overwhelming home crowd sort of advantage in the sense of, it's, you when Austin Hooper catches a pass, you hear, hoop and all that sort of stuff, and it's just drowning out everything else like you would expect at a home game and stuff like that. So it would probably feel more little closer neutral than probably people think. Last question comes from Mave2124. He asked, so Manuel doesn't get another shot with Rico and Key healthy. Wow. The NFL really stands for not for long.
Yeah.
I guess that's not really a question, but
yeah. Look, I think they should roll forward with the coordinators and just reset in 2019. And if we see some of the same struggles again, then maybe it's cause for, either Dan Quinn pulls back the reins and he becomes the D coordinator, or, I guess on the offensive side of the ball, people should know my opinions at this point. I think the offense has been improved this year. I mean, for one stat to point to, I mean, the red zone production alone, Sark has lifted the team from 49% last year to 66% this year, which has been in the top 10. So for me, I'll go back to what I said earlier in the show as far as I just think at times this team played some bad stretch of football, and a lot of it is on the players with the fumbles, the drops, the penalties. I don't think you can place that all on Sark. Sure, he's made some head scratching calls at times. For me, the 2nd and 10 runs, I don't get it, especially with the way they've run the football this year. But for me, and we talked about this before, and I kind of agree with where you placed him. I think he's like 3rd on the list of problems for the offense, 3rd or 4th. With some of the miscues I said, the offensive line regressing, being ahead of him. So for me, I think it is placing the blame game a little bit too much if they do in fact cut the coordinators, especially even Marquand Manuel, who I think is I don't want to call him a puppet, but I don't know how else to put it. I mean, he's running Dan Quinn's scheme, and sure, he's making some of the calls, or he's making the calls, but this scheme is built on having a certain type of personnel, especially along the defensive line. I mean, it's built on getting after the passer with 4 men consistently, and they can't do that right now with the personnel that they have. So that puts him in a bind. So for me, I want to see them reset. I want to see them bring back some of these guys healthy, like Keanu and Rico, the backbone of this defense. Have another off season, hopefully, concentrating their efforts on the trenches and get a defensive line that can rush the passer with 4. And I think, there's going to be some opportunities in free agency with the cap space that they have and the draft pick that, the high draft pick that they're projected to have, where that can become a reality. So yeah, I'm right there with you, man. I think it is a little bit unfair based on some of the injuries, based on the personnel that these guys have had to work with, specifically, Manuel on defense. And then again, I think the offense, the metrics point to it. They've done some really good things. And I think to tear that down and to make Matt Ryan, get comfortable with another offensive coordinator again, his 5th in 12 years, I just don't think that's the right way to go about it. I mean, Dan Quinn, if you're going to go down, you got to go down with the guy that you kind of entrusted. And again, I think they're doing good things. Sometimes the scoreboard doesn't always indicate it, but I don't think that's all on the play callers. So for me, I hope that they don't, cut the cord and kind of overreact after one season. But we'll see what happens.
I don't agree with the point that he has to sort of go down with the ship if, in that terms. But for the most part, I would say I don't really have sort of a horse in the race as far as the coordinators. I feel like Manuel gets scapegoat because, people don't like zone coverage. And like, I think the Falcons played zone. I think they have a very justifiable reason for playing as much zone as they have. They played a lot of zone last year, but no one cared because, they won games, and all of a sudden it becomes a major issue when they're not winning games. But like, I feel like Manuel gets scapegoated a little bit more so than due to the injuries, where like, I don't think this was a good defense going into the season. I think they were an average defense, maybe with the potential to be an above average defense if things went their way. But I don't feel like the struggles of this team, the reason why they're one of the worst defense, if not the worst defense, depending on what you look at, is because they were essentially an average to below average defense that, lost some of their key players. As for Sark, I've been very critical of Sark. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion about whether he should keep his job. If he gets fired, I'm not going to shed any tears for him. If they retain him, it's not going to be like, yeah, man, that was the right move and all that sort of thing, because I do think there is, at this point, a ceiling with sort of how good this offense can be with Sark. And I think we might have seen that earlier this season. That
was a pretty good ceiling, though. That was a pretty good ceiling.
It was a pretty good ceiling, but I still have, we've debated this before, but I still have questions whether or not he can sort of play get this offense consistently producing at that level against playoff caliber teams. But we won't know until we know. So far, the early returns aren't necessarily great in my eyes. But I think with Sark, like if he gets fired again, like I'm not going to shed any tears. But if they retain him, it's like fine. There's a lot of reasons for them to retain him. And I'm not going to necessarily advocate one way or the other. Ultimately, at the end of the day, and one of the things I always say is for assistant coaches, with the exception of the coordinators, 99% of what they do, we will never see as fans because it happens between, Monday and Saturday each and every week in the preparation for each and every game. And so I don't necessarily spend a lot of time or energy trying to be like to sort of dictate, Dan Quinn should do this with his coaching staff. Like Dan Quinn's coaching staff is whatever he wants to make it to be. And sometimes, he makes a bed and it's not a great bed and he has to lie in it. And sometimes he doesn't have to lie in it and he can, shuffle it however he wants to do. And I'm going to find a way to live with it because at the end of the day, I think, not to say that coaching doesn't matter or anything, but at the end of the day, the only thing I can sort of tell what's going on is what the players are doing. And, it is what it is, I guess, as far as that goes. So
the point I was making about, he has to go down with the ship if that's the case. I mean more so, I think there's blame that needs to be put on Dan Quinn as far as some of the personnel moves that have been made over the last couple of years, and namely, neglecting kind of the offensive line as far as in the draft and kind of continuing to expect veterans to, play on at their particular level for several years. And the fact that they kind of just took to day 3 and be like, yeah, these picks will be fine. And this will do. I mean, they had a shot, I was going back in the 2017 draft and just realized, I mean, they could have taken a Taylor Moton in round 2 instead of a Duke Riley. And, if Ryan Schrader's falling off the cliff like he is, you play Taylor Moton in and, you kind of patch up that hole and you don't have some of these issues that you're having now as far as, 4/5 of your offensive line has taken a little bit of a step back, or if not a major step back. So that's what I mean about something like that, because again, I think by cutting ties with these coordinators, you're placing the blame game a little bit, whereas I think the blame game should be placed a little bit more in Dan Quinn in certain aspects of what went wrong this year. So that's kind of where I'm at there. It's not just like, all right, if things are actually failing, all right, cut ties with the coordinator and look for a new one. But I think a lot of it has to do with some personnel mishaps. I think specifically the trenches, that is the biggest thing I think I can say. And I think that's even surpassing the injuries this year is, they overestimated what they had there and it came back to bite them on the butt.
Fair enough. I agree with you. I think I said as much back in the summer, but what I will say is this. I think, to me, what is going to be interesting to see is I feel like because of the poor finish that they're scheduled to have, we'll see sort of if they can sort of win 1 or 2 more games to sort of put a little bit of a bow on the end of this horrible, horrible season. But I think the issue that they're going to face is one of those things where I think heads are going to have to roll. Whose heads, I have no idea. But it seems very clear that unless the Falcons can really finish the season really strong and have sort of 2 more repeat performances of what we saw against Arizona, against Carolina and Tampa Bay, that you're going to see some major shuffling, not only with the personnel, but also with the coaching staff. Now, whether that leads to 1 or 2 assistants getting fired or 3 or 4 assistants getting fired, I have no idea. But I just feel like it's inevitable that given sort of the poor season, given sort of the pressure for Arthur Blank to put butts in the seats, we saw Jeff Schultz write about on The Athletic that, 30,000 people didn't show up for the last home game. And that to me is probably going to, stand out to Arthur Blank more than anything else. And I think because of that, he's probably going to sort of demand something to happen that at least he can sort of sell to the fans so that they can, those 30,000 people will be willing to, pay for tickets again next season.
Yeah, that's fair, I guess. I don't know. I'm conflicted, but yeah, I guess something's got to change. I guess one bad season is not acceptable when, I guess you're projected to be a Super Bowl contender. But for me, I think that's why the only thing I can think of is, Dan Quinn's got to take over the defense. And, like I was saying earlier, if you're going to go down, you got to go down with you calling the shots because, I mean, you're the defensive guy. And then as far as the offense, I just feel like you're starting over again. And why do that? Why take, a step or two back for maybe a marginal step or two forward? I just don't think, that's why I'd be concerned if that's the route to take, unless they get Gary Kubiak, which I guess could be a possibility. But if it's not him and, they threw out Darrell Bevel today, if you're throwing out Darrell Bevel, that's a lateral move in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that one.
And I mean, you mentioned, I guess, Todd Monken and Flip, which, I guess I could be okay with Flip. I am a little bit worried about what went wrong with him in Minnesota because, they put up a 40 burger this past week. So I don't know. For me, that's why I said Gary Kubiak or bust for me, because I just think that you'd have to blow it up and get a completely different system. And at least with Kubiak, it'd be a pretty seamless transition.
Yeah, like the only reason I mentioned Flip is just because he has such a strong reputation that I'm curious. Sort of, I haven't done any sort of deep dives into his offense or anything like that, but a lot of people that I like and trust that have football opinions have strong opinions of him and high opinions of him. So I'm intrigued by that, not to suggest that hiring him will fix the Falcons offense, but if they were to fire Sark and be like, we're going to bring in John DeFilippo, who did take over for Kyle Shanahan in Cleveland back in 2015, I would be intrigued by that enough to be like, okay, if all these people that have this high opinion of him are right, I could see how this could, work out in the Falcons' favor. But we'll have to sort of see how it goes. I feel at this point that it's likely that one of these coordinators is going to lose their job. It's hard for me to imagine, given the struggles that we've seen on both sides of the ball this year, that both of those guys retain their jobs. And obviously, there's been rumors and reports that both of the guys are on the hot seat, which, is also seems plausible to me as well. So I'll sort of be curious to see how it gets resolved, but I do think we will be hearing some news about the Falcons' assistants come Black Monday in a couple of weeks.
Yep.
Well, guys, that is our show. No longer a 2-hour extravaganza, just a good solid hour and a half. We will be back next week to talk about this Carolina Panthers game and previewing the season finale against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and probably talking more off-season stuff because that's what it's all about. If you want to send in your mailbag questions to be answered on next week's show, you can use the hashtag Falcons mailbag and we'll find it. You can tweet at the show's Twitter handle, which is FalconsPFC. Of course, my Twitter handle is FalcFans. Matt is Matt Karoly. That's Karoly. And of course, you can check out the show at ProFootballCentral.com. Pro Football Central is the name of the YouTube page, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you know when we go live each and every Tuesday night, as well as check out Falcon Central Radio on Facebook as well. And Matt, you mentioned sort of your part 2 of your offseason preview is dropping tomorrow. Am I mistaken?
It actually came out today. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So this morning it came out, so you can check out that Rise of Breeder, kind of just going through, what the Falcons could and might do in free agency, both, from an internal standpoint. I listed their free agents and who I think might be back, and then, listed out some big name or medium name external free agents that the Falcons might dabble with. So that's at Rise Up Reader. And then part 3 will be draft centric sometime in January. My good buddy Raekwon Gilbert will be helping me out with that. So we'll be giving some scouting reports on some guys that we think could be, potential future Falcons. So that's all on riseupreader.com.
Okay, I didn't get the chance to read it because I thought it was coming out tomorrow, so I didn't look for it today. So
Yeah.
I will read that and then subtweet
Yep.
my criticisms
Looking
of
forward
it.
to that, expecting that.
Yes. So you guys should definitely check that out so that you can get the full context of my subtweets and whatnot. So, all right, guys, appreciate you tuning in for another episode of Falcons Central Radio. We'll be back next Tuesday talking more Falcons. And enjoy the holidays, everybody.
Yes, Merry Christmas to all.
Yeah. I guess, is there going to be I should ask you live on the show.
Right. It's on Tuesday, right?
Is there going to be a conflict? I guess we might have to push it later in the week, I would assume, right?
Yeah, I don't think Christmas Day is a good idea, to do the show. Yeah. So, I mean, right, we could do it Wednesday if you want.
Okay.
I don't know what we'll
figure it out. This is probably a conversation that we should have behind closed doors. Yeah, but just a heads up for you guys, it's probably not going to be next Tuesday. I just realized that.
Good point.
So later in the week, we'll be coming back to talk more Falcons.
Catch you guys there.